Hello and welcome to Topic 8, Lecture 2, where we're going to be examining warrantless searches. As noted on the last lecture, at the end of the last lecture, that getting a warrant to a search is preferred, but it's not always practical. Getting a warrant takes time and other resources. And so there are times when it's reasonable to waive the warrant requirement. And the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court sort of sums this up well in some of his opinions that he's written about search warrant requirements, that he, had said that when it comes to the Fourth Amendment, it's the idea of reasonableness that is the touchstone of the Fourth Amendment. Not that you must have a warrant, but is the search reasonable? And if the search is deemed reasonable without a warrant, then it does not violate the Fourth Amendment. And so a search without a warrant is known as a warrantless search. These can be legal if within the scope of the exceptions that have been outlined by the Supreme Court. And so in this lecture, we're going to look at those exceptions to the need to the warrant that have been outlined by the Supreme Court. And so that's what we've got on the docket. So let's get started. Okay, so on the left-hand side here, we're going to list the exceptions to the warrant requirement. And as you are learning about these different exceptions to the need for a warrant, I want you to ask yourself, what's the reason for the warrant exception? And so, all of these are cases that an individual had been searched without a warrant, and they cried foul. They basically said, wait a second, my Fourth Amendment rights to be free from unreasonable search and seizure have been violated. And then they'll go to the Supreme Court. Well, they'll go to the lower level courts first, but if the case works its way up to the Supreme Court, then the Supreme Court is the one who will ultimately determine whether or not this search was reasonable and this search did not violate the Fourth Amendment, or they'll determine whether it did violate the Fourth Amendment. So when learning about these cases, ask yourself, what's the reason for the warrant exception? What's the scope of the search? So that's something that we're going to look at, that some searches might be legal without a warrant, but that there are limitations to that warrantless search. And then as you're learning about these, and hint, a question, about this will be on the final exam, that as you're learning about these different exceptions to the warrant requirement, ask yourself, are any of these, do you think that they should not be legal searches? Because all of these are legal searches. Are there any that the Supreme Court said are legal without a warrant, searches that are legal without a warrant, that you would say, that I disagree with the Supreme Court. That warrantless search is, in fact, a violation of the Fourth Amendment. So the different exceptions to the warrant requirement are, we're going to list these, and then we're going to talk individually about each of these on the following slides. So exigent circumstances, search incident to a valid arrest, automobile searches, consent searches, stop and frisk searches, and plain view searches. So these are all the exceptions to the warrants requirement that the Supreme Court has identified. So let's take a look at each of these individually. Okay, so let's look at the first example, which is exigent circumstances. And so no warrant is needed if the circumstances require immediate or urgent action from law enforcement. And that's what that word exigent means, basically an emergency circumstance. And there are several types of exigent circumstances that the Supreme Court has identified as circumstances where no warrant is needed to search. One example is hot pursuit. So let's say a hot pursuit is, basically where law enforcement are in immediate pursuit of somebody who has committed a crime. So let's say that there is, out in the, in the street, that there is a shootout between the police and another individual, and the individual runs into somebody's house to basically try to get away. Well, that's obviously exigent circumstances, an example of hot pursuit that the law enforcement saw, that they have probable cause that a crime has taken place, and that there's probable cause that the perpetrator is in the premises. And so that obviously can't wait to get a warrant because that person could get away. And so that is allowed. That's a circumstance that does need a warrant to search. A threat to evidence. And so that the Supreme Court has said that if there's probable cause that crucial evidence is being destroyed within a person's house or domicile or private property, that law enforcement can enter without a warrant. And if there's any circumstance where that there might be that there's probable cause that there's threat to others going on, then law enforcement can enter. So, for example, if people hear gunshots taking place inside of a house, the neighbors are outside to hear gunshots going off in a house. They call 911. Cops arrive. That there's a threat to others. And so they go on because they can go in because it's this situation that needs urgent attention. Why are these kinds of searches allowed without a warrant? Well, from the Supreme Court's perspective, they basically did a balance, right? They said that that since lives were in danger, evidence is potentially in danger, that the interest that the state has in protecting life and protecting evidence, for that matter, allows for a search without a warrant. But in all cases, these searches, even without a warrant, do need to be based on probable cause. And the scope of the search is really limitless if the emergency exists. And so that, if cops enter a home that in terms of hot pursuit of a perpetrator who committed a crime, they could go in the house, they could search upstairs, downstairs, in the basement, in the garage, whatever, right? So that the emergency exists, and so that the scope of the search is quite broad. Another exception to the need for the warrant is a search that takes place incident to arrest. And so police can search a person and the immediate area around the person after an arrest without a warrant. So once the person is arrested, that you don't need to wait for a warrant to search that person and to search the area around them. And it comes from the case that you'll be reading about in the textbook called Schimmel v. California. And this is also oftentimes referred to as the Schimmel rule, this exception. That the search has to take place immediately following arrest. And so the court has said, look, once the person's arrested, you can't wait for hours to search them, that you search them immediately upon arrest. And that also the search is only the area in immediate control of the person. Okay. So if you, let's say that you arrest somebody, let's say it's hot pursuit and somebody, goes into a house like we were talking about on the last slide, trying to get away from police. They apprehend that person in the house and they arrest them. The police can't then search the entire house. They can only search what is known as the grabbing area. So they can search the person's body. They can search like things that are on the person, like a backpack, in any area that's in immediate control of the person who's arrested. But the police couldn't then go and search other areas of the house that are not incident to that arrest. Once they arrest them, they can only search the person and the grabbing area. Also keep in mind that if a person is arrested and a search takes place, but that arrest was invalid, okay, then whatever they find as a product of that search is invalid as well. So if the arrest is invalid, the search is also invalid. So keeping up with that same example that we used, let's say cops, saw a person, pursued them and hot pursuit into the house. They arrested somebody and then they searched them and they found some illegal contraband. Well, if it turns out that they arrested the wrong person, that wasn't the person that they were in hot pursuit of, then that search is invalid. And also the products of that search become inadmissible in court. So why is this allowed without a warrant? Well, the court has said that it's basically for officer safety. And so that you want to be able to search a person at point of arrest, because even though they may be in handcuffs, they could still get something out of their boot or into their pocket or something like that, and then they could harm the individual. So that incident to arrest is due to officer safety. And that's why it's limited to the grabbing area. So the person's arrested and then they, that they might be reaching, they could be reaching to grab something, but then they could also be reaching to hide something. And so that we have that grabbing. And the scope is the grabbing area and a full body search. So it's the body of the arrestee and the grabbing area. The next exception for the need for a warrant is automobile searches. Cars can be searched without a warrant if cops have probable cause to believe that the car contains evidence that they are seeking. And that was established early on in Carroll versus the United States in 1925. This was a prohibition case, notice the date, and law enforcement had probable cause to believe that the individual who was in the car was trafficking in illegal liquor. They stopped him based on probable cause and searched the vehicle, and they said that the court said that search was legal without a warrant because there was probable cause that individual was engaging in a crime. And so the reason that this is allowed, why we can search vehicles without a warrant, is because cars receive a lower level of Fourth Amendment protection than other places. And so when you think about like your car related to your home, that there's a lower expectation of privacy with a car, that there's windows, you park it in a public place, people can just like look into your car and see what you're doing. So there's a lower level of privacy assumptions, and it's deemed that cars are not fully private. Also, that, and probably even more importantly, is that because cars travel on roads, that the state has a heightened interest due to the mobility of cars. And so that, it's one thing if you're doing something illegal in your home, because probably what you're doing in your home is not going to be transported to other places or easily discarded, right? I mean, police can collect evidence and get a warrant. But if you're in your car doing something illegal, well, it can harm others. It also can lead to some sort of interstate illegal activity, so just due to the mobility, the courts have said that there's like a lower Fourth Amendment protection for the automobile. So things to keep in mind about automobile searches, they need to be based on probable cause. And so even though you don't need a warrant, you still need to have probable cause. So for example, if you get pulled over in your car because you're swerving about, let's say you're swerving about in your car and you get pulled over. Well, that getting pulled over in your car needs to be based on reasonable suspicion. It's reasonable that a crime's going on, or, it's suspicious that a crime is going on because you're weaving around. Could be due to something else, but that to pull somebody over, you need reasonable suspicion. But then once they pull you over, at that point, in order to search you, that search needs to be based on probable cause. So let's say cops pull you over because you're swerving, and then they ask you what's going on. You unroll your window, and you're like, man, this is a rental vehicle, and I was trying to find the lights. It's getting dark, and I couldn't find the light switch, and that's why I was swerving around, officer. There's no evidence that you're intoxicated. There's no evidence of contraband going on in your car. And so at that point, there's not probable cause for arrest, and there's not probable cause for a search. However, if you are pulled over for swerving and you unroll your window and it's like, there's pot smoke drifts out, or you're all drunk, alcohol breath, drifts out, at that point there's probable cause, not reasonable suspicion, but you were swerving, most likely because you were drunk. And you can be arrested, and then you're arrested, and then you can search the vehicle incident upon arrest as well. And if you're swerving around, they pull you over, and then they look in, and then they see that, your car's filled with contraband. Again, you got probable cause to search. No need for a warrant. And so the scope of the automobile search, you'll be reading about this in the textbook, is pretty broad. With probable cause, the car can be searched, the driver can be searched, even the passenger can be searched, the trunk can be searched, and closed containers within the trunk could be searched as well. And so the Supreme Court has allowed a pretty broad berth in terms of the scope of that search, all sort of justified in that cars get this lower protection, and that also that the state has this heightened interest due to the mobility of the vehicle. It is complicated case law, so I've summarized it here, but make sure you read in more detail about it in your textbook. All right, so let's look at consent searches. So if you consent to a search, police can search you. They don't need probable cause to search. If they ask, can we search you, your car, can we search your house? And you say, yeah, go ahead, then that's allowed. So why is it allowed without a warrant? Why are consent searches viewed as constitutional by the courts? Well, you have a right to waive your rights. We have a lot of rights. We have the right to remain silent, but we can waive that right. We have the right to a jury trial. We can waive that right, get a bench trial, or we could, plead guilty and waive our right to a trial. And so you can also waive your right to be free from an unreasonable search. And so you have that right. Now, what is the scope of a consent search? Well, the scope is based on how much consent has been given. And so the consent that is given determines the scope of the search. So if police ask you, hey, they pulled you over and they don't have probable cause to search your automobile, and they say, hey, mind if we search your trunk? And you'd be surprised how many people agree to that. That if you say, yeah, you can search my trunk, go ahead, that doesn't mean they can search the rest of your vehicle. But if they say, can I search the rest of your vehicle? Sure, go ahead. Then that determines the scope of this search. Now, some things to keep in mind about consent search and their constitutionality. For a consent search to be constitutional, the consent must be voluntarily given. And so if cops are threatening you, if you don't consent to the search, we're going to beat you up, then obviously that's not you're not voluntarily consenting. Also, you must have the capacity to consent. And so that if you are inebriated and they ask you for consent to search, then that would not be intelligently given. You don't have the capacity to consent. If you're underage, you may not have the capacity to give consent to a search. If you are suffering from a mental disease or defect, then also that you may not have the capacity to consent. And so consent must be voluntary, and as it says there, intelligently or informedly be given. There are a limited third-party consents. So if you live with roommates, you might wonder, hey, if the cops show up and they ask one of my roommates, can you search the house? How can they do that? The answer is that, limited. So if cops come and they say, can I search your house? And the roommate says, yes, that cops are limited to searching just the common area. But if cops come and say, hey, can I search your roommate's room? No, that's your private area, and your roommate cannot give that kind of consent. And if there's disagreement among the roommates or among like a husband and wife, when the cops come and say, hey, can I search? And one of the people says yes, and the other person says no, the police consent has not been given. Now, if a lot of times students say, hey, I've been told that if you refuse to consent that to a search, that constitutes probable cause. And so if you get pulled over by police in your automobile and they don't have probable cause to search you, but they ask, can I search your vehicle? And if you say no, they're like, aha, probable cause. There's probable cause to believe you've engaged in a crime. Refusing to consent does not constitute probable cause. That being said, though, is that the law enforcement don't have a requirement to tell you that if you don't consent, you're free to go. Or that if you don't consent, that nothing bad is going to happen to you, right? They can keep asking you. And so when it comes to your Miranda rights, when you're arrested, they read you your rights, but law enforcement don't have an obligation to say that I'm going to ask you if I can search your vehicle, but if you say no, you're free to go. Okay, there's no requirement there for that. Okay, that brings us to, we have two more, stop and frisk and plain view searches. And so the stop and frisk is probably one of the most controversial types of searches wherein no warrant is needed. And in fact, many city municipalities and states are prohibiting the use of the stop and frisk, although it still does happen. And the reason, and you'll read more about this in the textbook, and you probably already know, that stop and frisks are often used against or perpetrated upon minorities, and so that it seems to be exercised with racial bias. And that's in large part because you don't need probable cause to engage in this stop and frisk search. All you need is reasonable suspicion, and that's a much lower level. So the stop and frisk come from the case Terry v. Ohio, and in that case, that an individual was searched. There was no probable cause, but the court said that no warrant was needed by the police to stop and search somebody if there were suspicious circumstances that that person was involved in. And so, in other words, that if you are so let's say cops are driving around in the middle of the night, and then they see some people loitering on the corner, and they're loitering there for a long time, right? Say it's 2 a.m. Well, that would meet that lower threshold that's needed for a stop and frisk, that it's reasonably suspicious. It's 2 a.m. in the morning. What are these folks doing out here? They've been here for a while. They look a little shifty and nervous, right? You can see how racial bias would play into this. And that allows cops to then stop and frisk an individual. So the stop and search are separate acts, that the search still must be a reasonable search. So for example, so if law enforcement stop you and start asking you questions, and it seems that you are involved in some suspicious activities, then that can lead to a search, a pat down. But if they stop you and they're like, hey, I see you hanging out here at 2 a.m., on the corner, what's going on? You're like, hey, I'm a security guard. I'm monitoring this area so thefts and robberies don't take place. It's like at that point that you cannot go on and search that individual because there's no reasonable suspicion. The reason that they allow these pat downs, these Terry stops, is that it's the Supreme Court, and you'll note are kind of Terry v. Ohio, 1968. There's a lot of crime in the United States at that time. It was sort of like officers need all the tools possible to fight crime. Officers also, when they are talking to people, they want to do a quick pat down so that the safety of the officer is not jeopardized. And the scope of it is really the pat down of the outer garments. Okay. So it's sort of like, hey, you talk to the individual, it seems like something suspicious is going on. You can pat that individual down, but you can't rifle through their backpack or engage in an automobile search, etc. And so, again, this is a controversial types of search wherein you don't need a warrant. And as it stands, we're starting to see an erosion of the use of the Terry stop. However, it is, if cops want to engage in a Terry stop, it's still a stop and frisk. It's still considered constitutional. All right, this brings us to the last type of search where there is an exception to the need for a warrant, and that's the in-plain view searches. So if police see contraband during a legal stop or search, they can seize that contraband without a warrant. And it comes from the case New York v. Class, which they talk about in your textbook. That's an instance where law enforcement pulled over somebody for a traffic violation. And then when they came up to the vehicle and they were like pushing some documents away for the legal authority to sort of see what the VIN number on the vehicle was, that when the law enforcement pushed the papers to the side, that in order to see the VIN number, they saw that there was a gun underneath those papers. And so they didn't need a warrant to seize that gun. And so, the idea of the plain view search is the reason that it's allowed without a warrant is for police convenience and safety. And so, for example, in the New York v. Class case, that you want to be able to seize that gun without a warrant because it jeopardizes the officer's safety. Also, let's say that a police officer has a legal authority to be in your home for whatever reason, and they come in, they have a legal authority to be here, and then when they enter in, they see like a big pile of cocaine on your coffee table, right? Well, I mean, it's really inconvenient at that point to sort of like arrest you and then wait to get a warrant and then seize the contraband. I mean, it's probable cause that the contraband on your table is, related to a crime. And so it's also police convenience to just be able to seize it at that moment. Now, there are scopes to the plain view search. And so there are 3 factors that need to be in place that the Supreme Court has said that makes a plain view search or seizure valid. One, an individual needs to have valid entry into your home. Not an individual, but law enforcement need to have valid entry into your place. And so for the instance with New York v. Class, the police had a valid reason for pulling that individual over. They had engaged in a traffic violation. So that the stop by police officers was legal, and so therefore pushing the papers away and seeing the gun, that was legal too. Police have to have legal authority to be in your home. Maybe you've invited them in, so they're legally allowed to come in your home. Maybe they have heard something or engaging in some questions and you invited them in. They're validly allowed to be in there. However, I mean, if cops can't, threaten you and come into your domicile and then see some contraband, like, it needs to be a valid entry. Also, the citing of something needs to be inadvertent. And so, like, if cops have a legal authority to be in your home and then they look on the table and they see the big pile of cocaine, sorry, I keep using the same example of a big pile of cocaine, but it's like, it's inadvertent, right? It wasn't like they were opening drawers or looking under a couch or looking behind the couch, the couch cushions to like find some contraband. It was inadvertent, as was the case in the Class case as well. And it needs to be related to probable cause. And so if you find a gun in somebody's car, it's probable cause that there might be a crime going on. Doesn't mean that a crime has happened beyond a reasonable doubt, but there's probable cause. If you have a big pile of cocaine on your table, probable cause that you've engaged in a crime. It's possible that you were using it for some sort of scientific experiment or something. Not that I think that would be legally allowable, but you get the point of what I'm saying. Recently, the court has extended the plain view search and seizure to plain touch, and so that the plain touch is like, let's say somebody is frisking you, doing a pat down, and then they touch something in you, like a little lump of something in your pocket, and it, to the plain touch, it feels like it might be contraband. Do you need a warrant in order to search that person? And they say that the court in Minnesota v. Dickerson said no. If there is a weapon search that a cop is engaging in, or a stop and frisk search, and they find a lump of something that can be taken without a warrant. However, that they also talk about the case in your textbook about how border agents entered into a bus and they were checking passports and immigration, making sure that the people that were on a bus from Mexico to Texas were like legal citizens. And they started touching somebody's luggage, like a canvas bag, and in it they found like a bar of drugs, and then the Supreme Court said no, that the plain touch can only be used during a weapon search, but that a person had a reasonable expectation of privacy, this is their luggage, and that there was no reason for the police to be touching that. So they do place limitations on the plain view and plain touch searches and seizures. All right, so in conclusion, we've gone through all of the 6 types of searches that where there's an exception for a need for a warrant. And just keep in mind that, as for our final exam, I'll be asking you questions about like, what are some warrantless searches that are legal, what's the reason for the exception, the scope of that search, and of these, are there any searches where you would disagree with the court and say that these warrantless searches should not be constitutional? Okay, thanks for paying attention. I appreciate it, and I will talk to you again soon.